Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Um, I want to thank everybody for being so punctual. I don't think I've really ever been part of a Zoom webinar that actually started on time, but so many of you were here so early. So thank you so much for that. My name is Senti Sojwal, and I am a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective. We're so excited to have all of you here with us today. Thank you so much for taking your time out to learn and build with us. I want to give a little bit of background on the Asian American Feminist Collective. There are 5 of us in leadership, and you'll meet all of us today. We came together pretty soon after the 2016 election, after really seeing the needs and voices and experiences of our communities as Asian Americans really ignored and marginalized in a lot of the feminist resistance and activism that came out of that period. And so what began as sort of an informal series of gatherings that we did around New York with community partners and other people who were aligned with our values and engaging in really similar issues of how we could really make ourselves politically useful in that moment, really sort of grew into us launching as a collective formally later that year. And so we engage in intersectional feminist politics grounded within our communities, including those whose backgrounds encompassed East, Southeast, and South Asian, Pacific Islander, multi-ethnic, and diasporic Asian identities. Through public events and resources, we really seek to provide spaces for identity exploration, political education, community building, and advocacy. We really believe that Asian American feminism is a world building project. By being here and sharing this space with us today, you are actively participating in and building and creating that project with us. And so we thank you. I want to give a little bit of background on this workshop in particular and where it really came from. Obviously, as we see larger conversations about racial justice and Black Lives Matter happening right now, we had been thinking really deeply about what it really meant for us to build futures of solidarity amongst Black and Asian American communities. And so we had a few months ago had a conversation with our friend Jamie, who runs Black Women Radicals, which is a group that really explores and uplifts radical histories of Black women and femmes and does a lot of work around that right now. And so we had a conversation on Instagram about Black and Asian feminist solidarities and sort of where our movements historically had really come together, how they informed one another, and sort of how we could pull from that history in this moment right now. And I think that it's something that, the tensions between our communities are things that are brought up really frequently, but I think that we also have a really long history of Black and Asian solidarity that is particularly useful to look into during this moment as we see a civil rights uprising that calls for us to really honor and stand with Black life. And so we really see this as a continuation of that first conversation, and not just as a moment in time, but as a lens that we can use as we think about our advocacy and our role as activists. We want to be clear that we are coming into this space from an Asian American feminist perspective, knowing that it's not the sole responsibility of Black people to do educational work around racial justice, that as Asian Americans, we benefit from and perpetuate anti-Blackness. We know that our communities are really hungry to grow, learn, and activate, so that's a space that we want to help create today. So throughout the course of this webinar, we are going to be using different chat prompts, and so feel free to use the chat function as we go along throughout the course of the hour. I also just want to say that we really want to create an intentional space today of learning and compassion and care. So we just ask everyone to keep that in mind as we do have conversations today that might be difficult. And so we want to all commit to creating that space of care and intention together. And yeah, with that, I'm going to pass it on to Julie and say thank you all so much for coming today to spend this time with us.
Hi, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. This is the first time using a webinar function. So Thank you all so much for being with us today. And I'm going to start with just a brief agenda of what we're going to be covering today. So we'll first start with a feminist grounding, why we are coming into this space with a feminist lens, and then a brief history of Black and Asian feminist solidarities and conflict that will be done by Saloni, and then some close readings of feminist texts, along with reflection and Q&A. And just to go over how this will work is we will start off with some reflection prompts before each text so that you can have that in your head and your mind while we're going over the text. And while the panelists are reading the text, you can feel free to chat in the chat function, just any thoughts or reflections that come up for you that have been prompted by the reflection questions and then the text as well. So we'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I'm starting off with a piece of text from Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. And before I jump into that, a few questions to have in mind is, how do you view feminism? What identities do you adhere to, and how attached do you feel to them? What resonates with you in this text, and what questions come up for you? Next slide, just, okay. So this text I'm going to read aloud first and then get into some of the deeper parts that I want to dig into. So feminism involves so much more than gender equality, and it involves so much more than gender. Feminism must involve a consciousness of capitalism. I mean the feminism that I relate to. And there are multiple feminisms, right? It has to involve a consciousness of capitalism and racism and colonialism and post-colonialities and ability and more genders than we can even imagine, and more sexualities than we ever thought we could name. Feminism has helped us not only to recognize a range of connections among discourses and institutions and identities and ideologies that we often tend to consider separately, but it has also helped us to develop epistemological and organizing strategies that take us beyond the categories woman and gender. And feminist methodologies impel us to explore connections that are not always apparent, and they drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions. Feminism insists on methods of thought and action that urge us to think about things together that appear to be separate, and to disaggregate things that appear to naturally belong together. So as I start, why a feminist grounding? And as for me, I think there are a lot of discussions currently going on, but I don't see that many discussions currently really imbuing feminism into current discussions that are happening. And as part of an Asian American feminist collective that looks to feminist politics to understand better current movements, I believed it was important to bring in feminism and a mutual understanding of what feminism is. As an Asian American feminist, I have gleaned so much insight and knowledge of Black feminists before me, so I'm excited to do this workshop. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that my own understanding of feminism when I first started this work a couple of years ago, and feminist politics has changed since I first started organizing. And so in our website, we talk a lot about like the evolution and the ever evolving definition of feminism. And that's what I want to think about today as well. So I chose this piece of text today because it challenges us to think beyond categories. And the first one, the first piece that I wanted to draw out was that feminism involves so much more than gender equality, and it involves so much more than gender. And I wanted to take this sentence out because I feel like for a lot of people, we might be thinking, how does it go beyond gender equality? And when we think about the term feminism, right, the term feminism has been so diluted, in my opinion, to just gender and to just the category of women. And still, I have seen it being co-opted and used by businesses, government, and people who are so far from what feminism stands for. We think about the call to have more women who are police officers, or more women as part of ICE, or to be part of the military. But to me, that is against my feminist principles to support a racist white supremacist institution that commits human rights abuses. Or for example, to support someone just because they are a woman, or just because they are espousing that they are for gender equality, or just because of their queer identity. But that doesn't let us think more deeply about, you know, who is this person and what does this person represent? Is it actually feminist? And I like to think about the history of the feminist movement, the third world feminist movement, and women of color feminism, because feminism is not just a singular movement, but many multiple movements. And how it started, when the feminist movement first started as a movement to focus on wealthy white women to vote, own property, have jobs, but how women of color, queer, trans people incorporated anti-imperialism, gay queer liberation, anti-capitalism into their politics. And the second text, which is Feminism Insists on Methods of Thought that appear to be separate and to disaggregate things that appear to naturally belong together, I want to draw upon theory of intersectionality. And intersectionality is definitely something that's been thrown around a lot, but I want to dig deeper into what intersectionality actually means and why we are intersectional feminists. So intersectionality, I first heard of it through Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins. And that piece, that article, helped me to break down what it actually means, which is the intersections of larger systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, and classism. And one example in that piece is on Asian immigrants who were affected by domestic violence, and without understanding how, you know, these different systems collide. And for example, Asian immigrant, predominantly women who had no easy way to access services because there was no language access, they didn't have more of the understandings of the struggles that Asian women were going through at that time. Kind of, for me, it was that one example of how intersectionality is such an important framework to use when we think about the current movement and how we plug into different movements currently. And the last bit, which is I often like to talk about feminism not as something that adheres to bodies and not as something grounded in gender bodies, but as an approach, as a way of conceptualizing, as a methodology, as a guide to strategies for struggle. That means feminism does not belong to anyone in particular. And so it's interesting because when we think about feminism, and a lot of people think about feminism, they think about cis women, white women as the default. And for me, the conversations around who gets included in feminism and who opts out of feminism because of their gender identity is important. Because to organize around a category and feel commitment toward this category of women, to me, it simply isn't as important to me anymore. Because I think I used to be invested in this idea of feminism and how women are organizing around feminism was important. But to me, as the more I think about it and as I reflect on this text, I realized that that isn't as important to me anymore. And recently I listened to Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson's interview in the early 1970s as STAR was just forming. And you can listen to this interview on Spotify it's called Making Gay History. And they as trans women talk about their own experiences and how their bodies were policed, sexualized. And when I talk to people in my life who are gender nonconforming or trans, we come to the conclusion on how patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, heteronormativity affects all of our lives, albeit in different ways. So again, it's not about this identity of being a woman, but more about the larger existing structures and systems that affect people of all genders. I'm going to pass it on to Rachel.
First, let's kind of just go through some of these reflections. Everyone had a lot to share.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone had a lot to share. Thanks everyone for throwing your thoughts in the chat. I love that there's so much engagement around all of this. I am seeing a lot of comments on you know, of course, disaggregating like what it means to be a feminist, different identity spaces, and moving beyond representation. I'm seeing lots on how there are differences, obviously, in white feminism and women of color feminisms. Of course, shout outs to Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins. We also have a request on what the podcast was called again, if you can share that.
Yeah, it's called Making Gay History. I'm trying to look up. Oh yeah, it's called Making Gay History. It's from The Vault. It's a Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson interview from the 1970s. Oh, thank you. Someone put it out there. So yeah.
Yeah, all right. Okay, cool. Let's move on because we have a lot to get through. Go next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel, also with Asian American Feminist Collective, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you so much, Julie, for that opening and that invitation for how we're coming into feminist space. And I think it's really helpful reading through all of your comments and really how this idea of how we're denaturalizing categories and being invited and thinking about new ones is a really capacious way for us to really think about feminist politics, right? And so I'll be opening up with a reading of the Combahee River Collective statement. And I think often, right, like we're hearing over and over again, when Black women get free, we all get free, right? Or as the Combahee River Collective statement reads, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And I think what that offers for us is to really think about what that means to us as a form of thinking about an invitation into new forms of relationships, right? And so what does that mean like for us personally, and how are we drawing on those connections within our feminist politics? And I think the Combahee River Collective statement, what it really offers is a way that we're thinking about identity politics as revolutionary political practice and a membership into collective struggle rather than individual demands for recognition, right? And so really thinking about what this means for the political formations that we're part of, and rather than take individual identity as a starting point, thinking about how we're part of collectivity and liberatory struggles against oppressive structures. So this, I'm just going to drop 2 links in here. This is a really helpful grounding and introduction into Combahee and identity. And then for those of you who want the full text, that second link is the text as well. And so as I read several of the excerpts from the collective statement, I invite you to think with me about what resonates with you about the personal as political. So reading their text, like how are you personally connecting with them and thinking about revolutionary struggle, and how does the statement invite you into solidarity? So I'll begin reading now. Okay, so our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, because of our need as human persons for autonomy. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the product. We are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. We have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of Black women who are generally marginal in the labor force. While at this particular time, some of us are temporarily viewed as doubly desirable tokens at white collar and professional levels. We need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working and economic lives. In the practice of our politics, we do not believe that the end always justifies the means. Many reactionary and destructive acts have been done in the name of achieving correct political goals. As feminists, we do not want to mess over people in the name of politics. We believe in collective process and a non-hierarchical distribution of power within our own group and our vision of revolutionary society. We are committed to a continual examination of our politics as they develop through criticism and self-criticism as an essential aspect of our practice. We know that we have a very definite revolutionary task to perform, and we are ready for the lifetime of work and struggle before us. So I'll pause there and give you all a second to respond. And then Tiffany will read a little bit from some of the things that you've shared out loud.
Yeah, I'm seeing some comments here already on how we're politicized, you know, by our identities in ways because we are reacting to a system that it's not possible to separate the political from the personal. See, we have someone saying that the sanctions in Black and white communities against Black women thinkers is comparatively much higher than white women, particularly ones from educated and middle class and upper classes. And also, you know, the thinking about intersectionality in our identity, or in their identities, the Combahee River Collective, as not just Black feminists, but also as feminist socialists, which was rare compared to most like mainstream feminist groups. And on how, people, of course, like in this conversation about abolition, we have been thinking a lot about how it functions in our personal lives too, whenever it comes to gender violence, punishment, accountability. I love that, you know, Angela Davis is bringing so much of like feminism into these conversations always. I feel like she's constantly bringing it in, and socialism as well, anti-capitalism, that, you know, in order to be an abolitionist, you also need to be feminist and anti-racist. Lots more on socialism and distinguishing between, let's see. Yes, to committing to anti-racism and truly intersectional feminism and socialism. Okay, yeah, y'all have a lot.
Before I pass to Saloni, I know one of the questions that I saw was like, what, like, for example, might be destructive or reactionary acts. And I think, so Saloni is gonna open it up for us on a genealogy of feminist solidarities. And I think seeing the comments around like the slow building and the process is really what resonates with me, right? Like that when we're thinking about dismantling like the current world that we have and building a new one, that's about how we're thinking in this moment, but building also for the long haul, right? And so having that vision in mind. And I've been thinking a lot about how we draw from disability justice frameworks, right? And that's really about process. And again, if we're doing rapid response work now, it's still about the long-term vision and the sustainability. So we're building a world like with intention and like where everyone can participate rather than like responding and like filling kind of things in reactionary ways. But I'll pass it over to Saloni to talk a little bit more about that history as well, and thinking again about when we think about solidarity, it's ongoing and it's a process.
Hi everyone, my name is Saloni Bauman, and I also use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to kind of go through a little bit and look backwards to locate a genealogy of Black and Asian solidarity in the United States, and give you a little bit of history. So bear with me, this is pretty content heavy. I'm a historian, so sometimes I can be a little long-winded. And I'm just gonna go through in a few different slides. But the first way that I think that we can approach this history, and Tiff, if you could do the next slide, thank you. Is by foregrounding diaspora and a long history of racial capitalism in our thinking. Scholars like Stuart Hall, Tao Lee Goff, and Moonho Jung have shown us that the histories of Afro-Asian interaction and solidarity are deeply shaped by histories of slavery, labor exploitation, and colonialism. Acknowledging that this history goes beyond the 20th century and is rooted in a much longer history of plantation labor, racial exploitation, and cultural exchange is critical to undoing some of the binaries we sometimes see reproduced in our own communities and conceptualization of what Asian and Black communities are. There are, of course, Black Asians. A more serious engagement with diaspora, particularly somewhere like the Caribbean, allows us to make space for the richness and breadth of the history that we're probing. The second is through examining the work of Asian American activists who worked, ooh, my slide fell, sorry, who worked alongside revolutionary Black activists and committed to a project of liberation themselves. These figures, and I've included photographs of Yuriko Chiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and Pat Sumi, were organizers and movement builders who formed revolutionary coalitions and solidarities with groups like the Black Panther Party, revolutionaries like Malcolm X, and were deeply involved in community-based struggles for welfare rights and labor protections and civil rights in service of a collective liberation. They largely came of age in the 50s and 60s and located their politics in their own experiences of discrimination, incarceration, and dispossession. Many of them became leaders and mentors within the Asian American movement that began in the 1960s and 1970s in America as well. So you may have seen these kind of images floating around. I know people have really been engaging with them. The third analytic, which we can approach these questions of Black and Asian feminist solidarity, intersects with the work of activists, intersects with the work of these activists, and it's really where much of our presentation is focused today. And it's the revolutionary history of intersectional women of color feminism and formations like the Third World Women's Alliance. I find that a little organizational history is helpful here, so bear with me. But in 1968, a group of Black women in SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded a subcommittee to address patriarchy within the anti-racist and anti-imperialist movement. Leaders of this group called themselves the Black Women's Liberation Committee and were concerned about a growing anti-feminist patriarchal sentiment within the liberation struggle itself, particularly around opposition to abortion as a racial issue by some SNCC members. Foregrounding the importance of a feminist praxis and the particular oppressions of Black women within the struggle, the BWLC were part of a growing Black feminist consciousness. We can locate their work and thinking in so many foundational places, from the politics of figures like Shirley Chisholm and Florence Kennedy, to understandings of something like reproductive justice, encapsulating more than just abortion access, but also maternal health care, food justice, and housing access. Together, they insisted that contesting patriarchy and building feminist solidarity must be a vital part of a revolutionary internationalist movement that had been dominated by men up until that point. In 1971, the BWLC joins forces with a group of Puerto Rican feminists, and they found together the Third World Women's Alliance, signaling the struggle against imperialism, racism, and patriarchy was a shared one. The TWWA's commitment to an internationalist and anti-imperialist and anti-racist formation was a feminist reorientation of a long history of international struggle that had connected violence against Black communities in the US with imperialist violence around the world. Opposition to the Vietnam War and the imperial objectives of Cold War conflict were really potent sites for building interracial solidarity and activism in this moment. And Asian American women and Asian women both participated in these formulations in different ways. The conflict in Vietnam was so powerful within struggles for liberation, and I always like to mention a delegation made up of Black Panther Party activists, white women, and Asian American radical Pat Sumi famously actually traveled to Vietnam in 1970 as a demonstration of solidarity with the cause. But the TWWA and the Women of Color formations found a great deal of inspiration and opposition to the war, particularly in learning from the experiences of Vietnamese women who had taken up arms against imperialism and their experience in a socialist country. Importantly, they argued that it was important for non-white women to share space together in order to better analyze the way that power and gendered oppression had functioned within their communities, noting that they had been marginalized and excluded from white feminist spaces. This identification of women of color as a category gave voice to the unique positions of being both gendered and racialized subjects. But as we think about this, I think it's so important to note that these activists analyze both commonalities in their experiences of gendered and racialized exploitation and colonialism, and centered that exploring difference of experience was just as valuable. And they did that through the writing and activism and creative writing that we're going to look at a little together later. And in probing those experiences of patriarchy within their communities and comparing notes, that's where the solidarities really built. As scholar Grace Hong argues, this was a politics of solidarity rooted in the engagement of difference rather than its obfuscation. Moreover, she notes that the TWWA gave the movement a theorization of the hierarchies of gender and patriarchy within racial and radical groups, and that allowed them to theorize solidarity across groups and histories as well. I've gone kind of over here, but I'm struck by, as we have this conversation in this moment, it's really important for us to also think about what has changed since that moment in the geopolitics of this time. What's changed between the relationships of Africa and Asia in this decolonial moment, almost 60 years after, you know, this kind of moment, how Asia's position in the world has changed, how Asia more broadly has nuanced within itself, perpetuates imperialism of its own. I've been really struck by the exciting conversations that are happening around anti-Blackness in Asia and thinking about things like the Dalit movement or untouchability as a way that we can make that come to bear in our communities as well. I'm also inspired by what Hong offers us as one of the legacies of the TWWA, and so I just wanted to leave you with that and share it with you in closing. Quote, an incipient and alternative political practice of solidarity that acknowledges differences of power and hierarchy within and across racialized and neo-colonized groups. The role of Asian American and Asian women within these movements can help illuminate the politics of difference that might otherwise just be implicit or overlooked. So I've gone over my time a little bit and I'll pass it back over to Rachel, but thanks for learning all that history with me.
Thank you so much, Saloni, for that history. I think really what you're illuminating too is like through this long history of solidarity is that this work is not easy, right? It takes time, it takes a lot of intention, and it takes so much work. And for me, I'm so glad that you brought in the Third World Women's Alliance and also Grace Hong's like reading of them, because like their work has like really also resonated with me politically, and something I've been marinating a lot is like their quote from 1979, like as their formation was ending, right? And that like the relationships contained within an organizational formation were no longer lasting, and the ways that they were really thinking amongst themselves, like what have been the things politically, historically, and socially that have added to and made our conditions, and how do we take those things and form ourselves so we can begin to destroy these conditions and build ourselves a new environment. Right, and so the essay that I really want to turn to is Learning from the 60s by Audre Lorde, which I believe really also offers us this theory of coalition by expanding on the contentions of coalition. And for me, Lorde really opens up these questions around the differential dynamics of power within communities by addressing accountability and complicity. So who pays for the cost of our inclusion, right? And Grace Hong, as an Asian American feminist scholar, like for me has really been a really great touch point of how I've also encountered this essay, right? Where she talks about the ways that Audre Lorde brings us this alternative vision of politics that isn't based on our self-interest. And so points of reflection, like in entering this space that I've been thinking about is how we divest from our own security, right? And as feminist abolitionist Mariame Kaba talks about, knowing that security doesn't mean safety, and how we decouple and denaturalize the oppressive forces that provide things that feel like freedom or security, but not necessarily is that, and how in organizing across difference, like the ways that difference is contradictory and political and brings together these conflicting goals of self-preservation. And so as I read aloud some excerpts from Audre Lorde, the reflection prompts that I have is, how does Lorde help us understand solidarity and coalition building? What are the difficulties of solidarity? And what is the kind of work that Lorde talks about, and how can we practice it? So I'll start reading now. If there's one thing we can learn from the 60s, it is how infinitely complex any move for liberation must be. For we must move against not only those forces which dehumanize us from the outside, but also against these oppressive values which we have been forced to take into ourselves. Through examining the combination of our triumphs and errors, we can examine the dangers of an incomplete vision, not to condemn that vision, but to alter it, construct templates for possible futures, and focus our rage for change upon our enemies rather than upon each other. We were poised for attack, not always in the most effective places. And when we disagreed with one another about the solution to a particular problem, we were often far more vicious to each other than to the originators of our common problem. Unity does not mean unanimity. In order to work together, we do not have to become a mix of indistinguishable particles. Unity implies the coming together of elements which are, to begin with, varied and diverse in their particular natures. Our persistence in examining the tensions within diversity encourages growth towards our common goal. So often we either ignore the past or romanticize it, render the reason for unity useless or mythic. We forget that the necessary ingredient needed to make the past work for the future is our energy in the present, metabolizing one into the other. Continuity does not happen automatically, nor is it a passive process. We lose our history so easily when it is not pre-digested for us by the New York Times or the Amsterdam News or Time magazine. Maybe because we do not listen to our poets or to our fools. Maybe because we do not listen to our mamas and ourselves. When I hear the deepest truths I speak coming out of my mouth, sounding like my mother's, even remembering how I fought against her, I have to reassess both our relationship as well as the sources of my knowing, which is not to say I have to romanticize my mother in order to appreciate what she gave me. We do not have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how it seeds our present. Can any one of us here still afford to believe that efforts to reclaim the future can be private or individual? Can anyone here still afford to believe that the pursuit of liberation can be the sole and particular province of any one particular race or sex or age or religion or sexuality or class? Revolution is not a one-time event. It is becoming always vigilant for the smallest opportunity to make a genuine change in established, outgrown responses. It is learning to address each other's difference with respect. We share a common interest, survival, and it cannot be pursued in isolation from others simply because their differences make us uncomfortable. To refuse to participate in the shaping of our future is to give it up. Do not be misled into passivity, either by false security or by despair. Each of us must find our work and do it. Militancy no longer means guns at high noon if it ever did. It means actively working for change, sometimes in the absence of any surety that change is coming. It means doing the unromantic and tedious work necessary to forge meaningful coalitions. And it means recognizing which coalitions are possible and which coalitions are not. You do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. And I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work towards that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time we recognize our sameness. So I'll pass it to Tiffany to read some of the recap from the chat here.
All right. Yeah, so this was from Learning from the 60s, Audre Lorde. I dropped a link in the chat. Let's see, Lorde speaks of her, speaking of her mother, makes me think of solidarity and coalition building as ancestral work and how we right now are also being called on to be good ancestors. Oh, I love that. It's important to carve out spaces for communities of color to establish communication and understanding with one another, because so much of the focus on anti-racism and solidarity work is on whiteness still. Yes, decenter whiteness, actually abolish whiteness. I'm gonna go further. Let's see. Talking about mom and grandma again. Malaysia was highly radicalized in a colonial space. Find my grandma secretly is more anti-racist because she had to flee. Yes, we learn from our intergenerational trauma, unfortunately. We have more comments on, let's see, chosen family and blood family. There's so many, I'm having trouble keeping up with everything. Blackness is not a monolith. We need to be careful about diminishing the violence and suffering of transatlantic slavery, especially when attempting to reclaim and relearn our identities and communities. All right, past and present. I'm sorry, there's so much. I really appreciate everyone bringing all these comments in. But I'm going to keep it moving so that we can continue with our readings. Let's see. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. Actually, yeah, so we're going to pass this on to Julie for our last reading, but as we do, we want to be sure to journal, keep on thinking about these topics, think about the work that we want to be doing, think about what solidarity means to us, and remember that we are creating this space not just temporarily, it's not just right now. We can't let conversations about Black and Asian solidarity and cross-racial solidarity be limited to this moment, to this current uprising. We need to make sure that this is a continual building and process, and to continue to think about these things even after today. And I'm gonna let Julie, if you want to turn your camera on. All right.
Hi, thank you, Tiff. Spotlighting my video. Okay, so for this portion, we're going to move a bit toward creative writing. And as Tiff talked about earlier with reflecting and journaling, I am going to take from this bridge called My Back, which has been really revolutionary for me personally. And we'd like for you all to reflect on those questions that were on the screen as we're thinking through this. So thinking about solidarity, I chose these few pieces from the text. The first one is from Speaking in Tongues, A Letter to Third World Women Writers by Gloria Anzaldúa. Writing is dangerous because we are afraid of what the writing reveals. The fears, the angers, the strength of a woman under a triple or quadruple oppression. Yet in that very act lies our survival, because a woman who writes has power, and a woman with power is feared. This is also from This Bridge Called My Back, from the Master's School by Audre Lorde. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all our lives in this place and this time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. Then the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all of our choices. The last selection from Letter to Ma by Mo Wu. But today there is breath possible through making connections with others involved in community struggle, bonded by love and the common goal for the liberation of mind, heart, and spirit. So I wanted to close out the reading of text with some of the text from this groundbreaking anthology, This Bridge Called My Back. And what drew me most to this piece was that many of us in this room are writers and perhaps affiliated with Kundiman. Thank you again, Kundiman, for this space. And I felt that this anthology really showed the power of stories to showcase the truth and the personal into the larger picture. So This Bridge Called My Back was published by the Kitchen Table Press, founded by Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde, which specifically brought together different women of color to publish and promote and create their own stories and texts, that they were able to take a lot of control over their narrative. And so the Kitchen Table Press published This Bridge Called My Back. They published Angela Davis, they published Mo Wu, and they really intentionally brought together women of color in this anthology. And for me, this showcased one way of how we can understand organizing across difference, and one way of organizing in solidarity, which was why I brought this piece today for us to reflect on as we close out. And for all of us in this room who are creative, who might be writers or any other, artists, to think through how the Kitchen Table Press was able to utilize their politics and really live out their politics in how they created this anthology.
All right, so we have a couple minutes, or let's see how much time we have. We have about 10 minutes to answer any questions if the panelists want to turn their cameras back on so we can see you. And so any suggestions for more specific reflection questions to begin doing internal work? So we did have some journal questions, but does anyone have any other ideas on ways to unpack all of this?
I know that I've been listening to Rachel and the rest of the Abolition crew a lot, so my kind of internal questions have been shaped by that, but I've been thinking a lot about disposability and a politics of care, and both how we can be more gentle in our approaches with each other, but also how we can really foreground thinking about understanding what someone else wants in our solidarity practice, right? Not just about what we want, but also how our experiences could shape entering a space ethically or gently, how to apologize well and how to accept apologies with grace. Those are the kinds of things that I've been reflecting on. I don't know if it's the right question for everyone, but.
Yeah, I think maybe going off of that, like somebody's, Leah Lakshmi's work, the book Care Work has really been super important to me recently. And I think one of the things that she poses too around like care as reciprocal in terms of that internal work, like is this kind of question of like, what do I need to receive care and what can I give, right? And I think that as an entry point to then also start thinking about like, well, what are the things right now that like give me safety and comfort, right? And then like really thinking about, but like at what cost, like is that safety and comfort coming from, right? And so kind of like a spinning of questions in those ways has been something that I've kind of been internally reflecting on as well.
We have a question on how can those of us who are first gen and finding our own political identities later in life, what kind of recommendations do you have to finding a place in the movement toward collective liberation? I feel like start where you're at is always one of the number one activism, what's it, like phrases, because what you're working in your own community, in your own neighborhood, within like spaces that you're comfortable in. For example, the Asian American Feminist Collective is my political home. I feel like just finding like-minded people and working with them. If there are certain organizations right now that you've been seeing uplifted, which we'll be doing some uplifting later, of some of our favorite organizations that really work in this solidarity space, there are people who, they want volunteers, sometimes they need help, and I think that is one way to plug in. And I'm sure other people on this panel have other suggestions, so I can keep on reading some questions. Oh goodness. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, to kind of go off of that question of like how people find their movement spaces and their different political homes. So the webinar that I was just on with Haymarket, we did a conversation on like for some of us talking about our entry points into abolition organizing. And for me, it was like this realization that it's been like years and years of like just being in different spaces. And it sort of started out from like thinking about like what it is that I have to offer. And for me, I'm someone who likes to do design work. And so that has been a way that I've entered into movement spaces and started to cultivate relationships and shown up in those ways, right? And I think for people who are looking for homes, there are a lot of different ways to like build upon like things that you already do and like it's valuable and necessary, and to kind of spend time showing up again and again. And even though the certain formations that you join like may not always last, a lot of those relationships will, right? And those relationships as part of that political process, and to keep building with people and like see that as like a kind of long-term commitment. And I think it kind of also spins off, there was another question, which now I'm losing because I can't find all of the tabs that I have open, about someone asking about like how you build internally across difference. And I think one of the things to really also think about is like people often enter like in and out of movement spaces like from their own experiences with violence, with their own experiences with the ways that systems have really harmed them, and how like in movement spaces like that's always like this container for difference is not always like easy to be around, right? And that like to how to sit with and move in these movement spaces like with discomfort at times, and then also with a kind of awareness like of the people around you and like kind of practicing this like really active listening and hearing of like what people of what people need, but also like sitting with like discomfort in movement spaces. Because I think oftentimes it's not easy to be in those spaces. It doesn't always like feel great, but I think a lot of really beautiful movement work and like the kind of vision, political vision, and the ways that it gets practiced and actualized is this longer term commitment of sitting with the difficulty.
Yeah, so we have one question that got a bump, but people have been curious about the phrase "yellow peril supports Black power" and the conversations about it being problematic and decentering Black struggle, rather than referencing a historical moment of solidarity. We really appreciate this question. This is something that we have been talking about as well, seeing this conversation bubbling up to the surface recently. And I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I'm going to hand the mic over to Senti because I don't feel like talking about it right now.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for bringing this up. I know that it's something that a lot of Asian American activists are talking about a lot. And I will speak for myself while also saying that this is definitely a conversation that we've had amongst the 5 of us in our collective and thinking about our space in the movement. And you know, I will say that our communities are historically and egregiously anti-Black. We can't deny that. And I personally do feel that we have a responsibility to honor the history of solidarity that does exist between Asian and Black communities and really call on that history in this moment in a very specific way. I think that Yellow Peril supports Black lives is today's Asians for Black lives. I think that the language and its history are imperfect. And I also think that movement work is imperfect. And I think that we are allowed to hold space for that while we also honor that history that does exist that is really important. And I think that, you know, when we only say Black Lives Matter and we're not actually really specific about our place in this history as non-Black people of color who again benefit from and perpetuate anti-Black racism, I think that that is irresponsible. And I think that Asians for Black Lives is a really pointed call to our community to stand with Black freedom fighters as fellow people of color while acknowledging our difference, while acknowledging that our liberation is collective and does take all of us. And I think that liberation's uncomfortable. Solidarity work is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. And I also just think that I personally feel a little bit, I think there is a lot of incongruity in saying Asian American activists are taking up too much space in the movement for racial justice. And then sort of, I'm like, I don't really want to have a conversation about that because I'm like, I think what we need to be doing is the work. And I sort of feel like when the space in the conversation is taken up by saying, you know, you're doing this in a way that maybe people might find offensive or difficult, I do have to say that I feel like I'm seeing a lot of that really come from Asian American activists in a way that I feel like that is what is taking up space for me that I personally feel is not as productive as actually just doing the work. So I will say that it is an important conversation to have, but I also want to say that that is not really the most important part of the work that we have to do in this moment.
Yes, thank you to Danielle saying Loretta Ross teaches that circular firing squad benefits no one. We are all on the same team, or we should, I think that we seem to be on the same team. We have hopefully some similar goals. So calling out your goalie or your, I don't know, some other sportsman term doesn't really do the work that we need to be doing. And I will just add, I know I said I wouldn't say anything, but I will just add that I know a lot of the discomfort comes from, let's say, Asian rappers or something who use this term in a way that, like, they might say hashtag Asians for Black Lives because thank you for giving us rap so we can now rap. And maybe if those people saw these call outs and felt like I need to remove my post because I'm not practicing solidarity correctly, then I think that's fine. I think it's fine to own up to the fact that you were trying to center yourself, or that you weren't practicing solidarity in a way that felt right, but that in general, policing everyone's activism isn't necessarily helpful, and that yes, Asians for Black Lives was a real thing that that came from a moment where there were Asian American activists who were perpetuating anti-Blackness in the case of Peter Liang, a cop who murdered Akai Gurley, a Black man. And that people came out and said hashtag Asians for Black Lives because they wanted to be very distinct in saying that they were going to practice solidarity when members of their own community wanted to uplift the model minority myth. They wanted to allow us to be used as this like cudgel against other minority groups and in perpetuating anti-blackness. And so the phrase comes from a place of solidarity. It's not meant to center Asian Americanness, but it is meant to call out the anti-Blackness within our communities and to really make sure that that everyone out there knows that we are not going to be complicit in that anti-Blackness. So yeah, we have some other a lot of questions about you know, how to talk to other folks outside of like these spaces. For example, our parents, other members in our community, people who might not have the same, you know, academic texts and stuff. I will say that I've been seeing some really great stuff on social media as far as translating the Asians for Black Lives letter for Black Lives, I believe it's called. And I'll let everyone else share their own resources as well, so I can pass the mic.
I have a quick thought, and I think that, you know, one of the things that I often come back to, I keep saying like gentle approaches and care and a politics of care. And I think I most specifically mean that when I think about how we can kind of deal with this issue of like moving people who don't agree with us within our communities or who are not engaged in the same conversations that we are. And sorry, I'm having like a galaxy brain moment, but I really think that one, we have to be strategic and we should think about these things strategically, right? So what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to have a conversation with your parents who think that the police keep them safe and they're really upset by this moment and you want to move them? I think that you should relate to them as their child and share your experiences and what moved you, and do so with like respect and kindness if that's your relationship to them. I've seen a lot of work kind of comparing conversations around like harm reduction, especially around safe sex, and how you can have conversations that bring people in by saying that you're here to help them. That's kind of what I see as our work in this moment, right? We're not here to yell at each other. We're here to create the conditions where people feel safe taking a leap of faith, so that we don't all just get into our corners and like double down on whatever we think to begin with. And similarly with the Yellow Power Supports Black Lives, I think that if that's all you posted and you think it's a, you know, cool graphic and you're not doing any other work, perhaps that's where the discomfort comes from. But if you're kind of actively recruited in dismantling white supremacy and you're being like, are you embodying yellow peril? Are you like a danger to the state and the status quo because you're out in the streets or doing activism online or writing? Like, then I think that you're kind of inhabiting that in a different way. And it's okay to stand in security about like what you've done. And I think that we have to kind of be open to critique, but not so afraid of looking bad or so afraid of being kind of in the wrong or not cool that we don't actually stand up for our personal ethical compasses as we like move through this work. I don't know, it's tricky, it's challenging. We're learning a lot.
I know Senti's going to go over resources, but maybe a good close, at least for Q&A, is like another Audre Lorde quote from Uses of Anger, where she says, "Guilt and defensiveness are bricks in a wall against which we all flounder. They serve none of our futures." And I think that's like a really helpful way to kind of make sense of also like feelings in this moment and like what are the uses, like what are the kind of political uses of anger that we can mobilize now. But I know Senti will close us off with some resources.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Rachel. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So I do want to be super conscious of everyone's time. Here are some different organizations and mutual aid funds that we really love that are doing critical work in this moment and always. So please feel free to screenshot this. We also routinely share different organizations that we love and are supporting on our Instagram and our various social media. In lieu of a fee for today's workshop, please consider donating to Survived and Punished, which is a grassroots prison abolition organization dedicated to freeing criminalized survivors of gender-based violence who are being held in prisons in New York. We really suggest you look into their work and support them if you can. We do have one upcoming project we're going to be publicly announcing very soon, but we're going to be launching a bit of a longer term project with Black women radicals, where we're going to be able to continue exploring some of these issues more in depth, and where we hope to be able to continue to offer resources, scholarship, and learning about cross-racial solidarity and feminist activism. You can stay in touch with Asian American Feminist Collective on our Instagram at aafc.nyc. Also on our Twitter, oh great, all of our handles are right there, and on our website, asianamfeminism.org. We are very much grassroots. It's really just the five of us. So any way that you would like to support our work that you're able to, we'd really appreciate, whether that's a donation or just like amplifying the work that we're doing. We also are really big on collaboration. We really love to build community and work with our community. And if you have a project or a way that you can think of that we could work together, we would love to hear it. Please get in touch with us. I also want to do a huge shout out to Kundiman, which does such amazing work in our community and the literary community. We're really, really grateful for this space, and thank you so much for giving this platform to us. Please stay in touch with us, and we're here. We know that it's a really hard time for so many reasons, so please do reach out, be part of our community, and we're sending a lot of love to all of you from us.